If you are like me when it comes to video games, you don't take a lot of stock in what critics say about a game. You would rather go play it yourself because let's be real, a lot of these critics, well, they're journalists and writers that don't even play video games. The gap between critics and gamers is getting bigger and bigger. It seems like more and more the critics are just on their own little planet while the gamers are actually analyzing the stuff that gets put out. Welcome to Chaos Gaming, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at some different times where the critics and gamers were absolutely not on the same page. Let me know in the comments what you thought about these games, and if you thought the critics were right or wrong, drop a like, make sure you have your notifications on. And let's start off with God Hand. This is a cult classic game from 2006. It is one of the most infamous games in the industry's history because of how bizarre it was, but also how polarizing the reception was. God Hand was a single-player beat-em-up with a ton of over-the-top set pieces, story elements, made it extremely cheesy, but it was very fun. The gameplay was super challenging, both because of the game design and because there was just some weird quirks that went unfixed during development. Upon release, God Hand got mixed reviews from critics who liked the presentation and the story elements, but they didn't like the gameplay. Gamers, on the other hand, loved God Hand's old-school style and thought it fit perfectly with the vibe that the story was going for. On Metacritic, God Hand is sitting with a 73% from critics, but a 92% from gamers. And if you think that's a big gap, just wait. We're only at number 10. Next up, Guitar Hero 5. This is a franchise that should have quit while it was ahead, but it unfortunately had to die a long, slow, painful death that ultimately concluded when the developer started trying to please the critics instead of the fans. That's a big no-no. As you probably know, Guitar Hero was a game that made a name for itself. A rocking soundtrack, gameplay extremely hard to master, super satisfying, you guys know. However, with Guitar Hero 5, it decided to make a controversial move and abandon much of what the series had been based on. The rocking soundtrack was replaced with lighter, more contemporary alternative rock and pop rock songs, and since most of the hard rock and metal songs were now gone, the game overall was dramatically easier than previous entries. Needless to say, critics loved Guitar Hero 5 for the soundtrack and easier gameplay, but gamers, they hated it for how easy it was and how much of a step backwards it was from previous titles. Guitar Hero started out as a challenging love letter to rock and roll, but Guitar Hero 5 was a safe cash grab going for the widest possible audience, and when you try to please everybody, you end up pleasing no one. On Metacritic, Guitar Hero 5 is sitting with an 86% from critics, but a 58% from gamers. Next up, Dragon Age 2. The first Dragon Age game, it was excellent. It was a good fantasy RPG, lots of potential for expansion. However, when Dragon Age 2 rolled around, there was a giant divide between the critics and the gamers, and it's not hard to see why. Compared to the first game, Dragon Age 2 was much easier, far more streamlined, removing much of the depth that made the first game unique. Many assets and environments were reused from the first game, and the game felt much less like an RPG and more like an open-world action game. Critics, they loved it. Praised the streamlined combat and the simpler gameplay of Dragon Age 2, while fans ripped it apart, with many calling it one of BioWare's worst games. According to Metacritic, Dragon Age 2 has an 82% from critics, but only a 44% from users, making it one of the most polarizing games in BioWare's lineup so far. Now, the third Dragon Age, they managed to fix a lot of the problems with Dragon Age 2, so let's hope the fourth installment doesn't slip up. And are you seeing a trend here? Critics like easier games. I wonder why. Fallout 4. Speaking of streamlined RPG sequels, Fallout 4 is perhaps one of the most notorious ever released. Fallout 3 completely revamped the Fallout license, while Fallout New Vegas is arguably the best game in the entire series. However, Fallout 4 created such a rift in the community that it's still talked about. We're talking about it. I mean, it was released, 6 years ago? It removed most of the RPG elements from the previous games and basically turned it into an open-world shooter with very light RPG elements. The game also launched with a laundry list of technical issues, many of which modders had to fix because Bethesda never patched them. That's sad. Now, despite the countless downgrades from Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Fallout 4 was praised by critics for its simpler gameplay, you see that trend, and streamlined combat that made it more accessible. Meanwhile, fans ripped it apart. I mean, from its deviation from franchise roots and the abundance of technical problems that critics, they just ignored it. It didn't matter, it was so easy, it was easy to play. On Metacritic, Fallout 4 is currently sitting with an 88% critic score, but a 65% gamer user score. You guys get what's happening here. Next up, Sonic Unleashed It's a weird game to talk about, partially because I haven't played it in over a decade, but also partially because it's gained a massive following in the recent years after people went back and revisited it. Released in 2008. Sonic Unleashed was a blend. Traditional 3D Sonic levels with a big beat-em-up section like you'd find in God of War, Devil May Cry. It was an odd mashup, but if it works, it works. Upon release, the game got extremely negative reviews from critics who hated the hybrid gameplay and pointed out many technical issues. The reviews were so bad, the Sega even pulled the game from digital marketplaces in an attempt to keep Sonic's reputation from getting worse. However, in recent years, more gamers have been revisiting it, and they love it. They call it underrated. On Metacritic, the game has a 60% critic score, but 82% user gamer score, with fans praising the level design and the visuals. Most agree that the beat-em-up sections are tedious, but the traditional Sonic levels are some of the best in the entire series. Now we've reached number 5. Kirby Air Ride. This was another weird concept for a game, but it went on to be a fan favorite. Most Kirby games are platformers with some puzzle elements, but Kirby Air Ride was a racing game where you chose one of the various vehicles from the Kirby universe and you used them to square off against other players. Visually, the game's extremely impressive for something that launched in 2003, and it had a really good soundtrack to boot. It wasn't anything crazy or mind-blowing, it was just fun. Fans loved it. But guess what? Game journalists really weren't a fan of Kirby Air Ride. I don't even like the title Game Journalist, honestly. It was criticized for being too simple in drawing comparisons to other Nintendo racing games like Mario Kart and F-Zero. On Metacritic, Kirby Air Ride has a 61% from critics, but an 82% from gamers and over 1.2 million copies sold. If you haven't figured out the trend here, if you use Metacritic to buy your games, be careful. Just be careful. At number 4, The Last of Us Part 2. Now, let me first say, it was a very well-presented game with some absolutely incredible technical achievements. However, the actual content of the game is where things took a dramatic split. The story of The Last of Us 2 was extremely controversial. Many fans of the series saw it as a slap in the face. The game's length was also a heavy point of contention, as most gamers agreed it went way too long and the gameplay was almost entirely unchanged from the first game, making it feel more like an expansion. Now, the gamers were divided on this game, whereas the critics, well, they were all in perfect agreement. It was the greatest thing ever made. The Last of Us 2 swept almost every award and show in 2020. Many critics have called it the best game of all time. But how? Like I said, the gamers were split. Some people loved it, some people hated it. Some people thought it was okay, you get the drill. The game certainly got a lot of discussion going around, which is usually a good thing. But why were all the critics so uniform in their praise? Why were all the professionals seemingly incapable of criticizing this game? I don't even think The Last of Us 2, I don't think it's a bad game. It's definitely not deserving of all the praise it got. And best game ever? That's a slap in the face to best games ever. At number 3, DMC. Devil May Cry is one of the most iconic hack and slash franchises in gaming history, and its characters are known by just about everybody. Heck, Dante is one of the most boss characters in any video game, but in the early 2010s, someone somewhere decided that Devil May Cry just wasn't modern enough, and they decided to do a full series reboot. They simplified the gameplay, transforming series protagonist Dante from a mature, cocky demon hunter to a whiny teenager plucked right out of Hot Topic. You can guess where this is going. I have no idea whose idea it was, but it was awful. The gameplay of DMC, Devil May Cry, it's not bad, level design's okay, but the characters were awful, and the story, it made next to no sense. It's an average game, it's just it. But guess what? Game journalists loved it. At number 2, Battle for Bikini Bottom, Rehydrated. Here's a recent one. This was a SpongeBob game released back in the early 2000s for the GameCube, PS2, and original Xbox, okay? It was a 3D platformer like many licensed game at the time, and it wasn't mind-blowing or life-changing, but it was pure fun, and many people consider it to be the best SpongeBob game ever. A few years ago, THQ announced they would be remaking Battle for Bikini Bottom, and it finally released in 2020 to this bizarre split between critics and fans. I mean, it was extremely faithful as a remake of the classic 3D platformer, but upon release, critics hated it. They didn't like the old school design and relatively high difficulty game. Licensed game used to be a lot harder back in the day. Fans, on the other hand, adored the remake for its faithfulness to the original and how nostalgic it was to revisit such a classic experience. Now, from critics, the game scored in the mid-60s. From fans, it went well into the 80s. I mean, what's wrong with games just being fun and challenging? It's really simple here. Critics like easy games. That's it. That's what I'm getting from this. Finally, at number 1, FIFA 21. Yep, a game that perfectly highlighted the gap between critics and gamers. FIFA 21 is a train wreck of a game that was about 70% copy-pasted from FIFA 20, probably more than that. Plus, It was loaded with microtransactions, some of which are arguably pay to win, good old FIFA Ultimate Team. Then, just as the icing on the cake, the Switch version of FIFA 21 was literally just FIFA 20 with new branding. Now, with all that being said, it should be surprising that on Metacritic, the gamers gave FIFA 21 an 8% user score. 8%, people. You know what the game got from critics? 71. There's not a single negative review for FIFA 21 on Metacritic. If that doesn't highlight just how out of touch game journalists are, I don't know what does. Or what behind the scenes things happen for these critics to give these reviews and they completely be one-sided. Do not take critics' reviews as your final offering before you buy a game. You're a gamer, trust me, you know better than they do. There you go, everybody. Let me know one game that fits this category that we didn't put on here, and I'll see you soon.